my intro. All right, folks, we're going to go live online and then we will get things started. Just going live online. All right, welcome everyone. My name is Lara Villamat, she and hers. I am the head of Outreach and Community Experience here at the Framingham Public Library. We are so thrilled to have you for tonight's Lifelong Learning Lecture featuring Dr. David Smailes. He will be discussing the new American Presidency, the Unitary Executive. This is our final Lifelong Learning Lecture for this particular series, and we will pick things up again in January. We hope to have our flyer ready pretty soon. We're still waiting on some outstanding descriptions from our speakers, but we will have that for you as soon as humanly possible, and we hope to see you at some of those upcoming events. This is a collaborative program between the Framingham Public Library and our partners at Framingham State University. A few quick announcements before we get started tonight. For the folks in the room, could you please take this opportunity to silence your cell phones? Any alarms, ringers, anything like that, go ahead and turn those off. Folks at home, please snuggle into your couches a little deeper and grab your favorite beverage. For the folks in the room, we do have an evaluation form in the back. So at the end of tonight's program, we would love to hear from you what you thought about tonight's event, if you have any ideas for future events, and if you're not already on our mailing list, we would love to have you join us. We are the library, so the only thing we will ever send you is more information about great free public library programs. We won't do anything else with your email, I promise. The library is open until 9 o'clock tonight, so if you have a chance after tonight's lecture, feel free to browse the collection and take something home with you. A huge thanks to our sponsors, of course, the Friends of the Framingham Public Library, without whom events like this would not be possible, and the Joseph L. and Ray L. Frond Foundation, courtesy of Elizabeth F. Fideler. And with that, we are very excited to welcome Dr. David Smailes.
Thank you. Thank you very much, everyone. Thank you. Great to be with you tonight. I didn't know I was the last in the series, so I'll try to have us go out with a bang, right, before all the holidays come. My topic tonight is to talk about the new American presidency, and I put new in quotation marks because what we're going to talk about isn't so much a new version of the presidency, but a use of presidential power that we've never seen before. And I want to be able to explain that to you by talking a little bit at first about how presidential power has grown over the years, what's led us to this moment, in other words. And then we're going to talk a bit about the ways in which presidents have been using presidential power in this new way, this concept of the unitary executive, as it's being called. And then with that, talk a little bit about what's going to be likely coming up in discussions in the 2024 election around all this. So we'll kind of weave those three parts together as we sort of take a journey through the development of the American presidency. And, you know, let me start with something we're probably all pretty familiar with, right? We've all heard these words before. That's the presidential oath of office. It is in Article 2. It is a requirement that every president say those words before they become president. So when a president is sworn in, they are, in essence, taking on the presidency once they say those words. It is the only constitutionally required oath that we have. No other office in the government requires an oath of office. Now, you've probably seen pictures of members of Congress being sworn in or Supreme Court justices being sworn in. That's all tradition. It's not required in the Constitution that they be sworn in that way. But the president does have to be sworn in this way. The president does have to utter these words. And if those words are not uttered, a person is not president. So a president-elect does not officially become president until that oath is given. Kind of an interesting example of how seriously people take this. In 2008, when Barack Obama took the oath of office, or I should say January of 2009, right, when he took the oath of office, he was given the oath by Chief Justice Roberts of the Supreme Court. John Roberts, the Supreme Court Chief Justice, traditionally issues or gives the oath of office. Roberts tried to do it from memory. And that's always a bad thing to do when you have an official function to carry out, right? So when Roberts gave President-elect Obama, but still technically Senator Obama, the oath of office, he mangled the first sentence. he said, "I do solemnly swear that faithfully I will execute the office, or I will execute the office of President of the United States faithfully." He moved the word faithfully in the wrong place. And Barack Obama, if you want to take a look at YouTube, all these things are available on YouTube now, right? You can actually see President-elect Obama kind of hesitate because he knows the oath has just been misquoted to him. But he goes ahead and says exactly what Roberts has told him to say, because I think he didn't want to embarrass Roberts. Well, later that night, they brought John Roberts back to the White House, and Barack Obama took the oath of office a second time, this time saying the words correctly because John Roberts had it written down on a piece of paper, and officially became president, you could say, later in the evening than the actual day that he was inaugurated, simply because he had to actually say these words. So the founders took this very seriously. That's my point. They put it into the Constitution for a reason, and they felt it was an important thing to be said by a president being sworn into office. You'll notice, by the way, the last part that's traditionally said, "So help me God," is not included in the constitutional oath of office. Apparently, George Washington added that at the first inaugural, and ever since then, the tradition has been that presidents do say, "So help me God," as they take the oath of office, but it's not constitutionally required in that way. So why these words? Why require this? Well, we have to talk about the founders' vision of what they thought the presidency was going to be, because their understanding of those words, I think, is a little different than our understanding of those words. Let me go back to this for just a minute. You know, when I read the words, "I will, to the best of my ability, preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States," I usually think of the commander-in-chief power, right? The military is going to be used to protect and defend the Constitution. The founders didn't think of it that way. When the founders conceived of the presidency, and we have a sense of this from the way in which they wrote about this office afterwards, their sense of the president was that the president was going to be something of a political umpire in the game of politics. And I hate using sports metaphors because they really get overused in politics a lot, but this one really works, I think. Their conception of the president was that the president was there to make sure that Congress followed the rules of the game, so to speak, the Constitution itself. The president's job was to make sure the Constitution was followed and obeyed. So Congress would be the place where politics would take place, deliberation would take place, discussion would take place, and the president's job was to make sure that whatever Congress did was in fact in line with the Constitution. Now, like with any other umpire, the umpire cannot favor one side or the other, right? So their expectation was the president would step in to do this job and use the veto power to prevent Congress from passing laws that were unconstitutional. And I know we usually assume the Supreme Court does that job, right, deciding on constitutionality. But in fact, nowhere in Article 3 of the Constitution that gives us the description of the Supreme Court, nowhere does it say the court has that power. It's a power they claimed much later in 1803 in a decision called Marbury versus Madison. It seems much more likely the founders had the president in mind to monitor laws to make sure they were constitutional. And if they were not constitutional, the president would issue a veto. And in the course of issuing that veto, explain the veto. The Constitution actually requires the president issue a veto message to explain why the president's vetoed a particular law. So much like we think of the Supreme Court issuing opinions on whether or not things are constitutional, the president was supposed to use that message to communicate why he thought the Constitution was not being obeyed by Congress. So in order to do this job well, like any good umpire, you can't favor one side or the other. The expectation of the founders was that the president would be politically neutral. The president would not favor one party or the other. The president would be above politics, separate from politics. And in fact, the Electoral College was created to choose this president in a way that removed the public from having any say in who the president was going to be. Now, today we vote in presidential elections, and our votes are used to decide which particular candidate gets the electors from our state. But in the original Constitution, the electors were appointed by state governments, mainly the state legislatures. And those electors were chosen because the state legislature thought they would be good judges of who the first president should be. So The electors were not elected by the people. We had no say in who our first presidents were. And I say the people maybe with quotation marks around it because it was a pretty limited group back then, right? White males over 21 who owned property was basically the law in many states. So the bottom line is presidents were not chosen by the people. The president was chosen for the people by these electors. And the public had nothing to do with the president's, the choosing of the president to occupy the office. So presidents were supposed to be apart from politics, apart from public opinion, neutral in their view of politics, acting as a good umpire. So when the oath of office says, the president will, to the best of my ability, preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States, the founders meant that the president would use the veto power to stop unconstitutional legislation from being passed. What we associate today with the commander-in-chief power, they thought of as the power the president would use to make sure the Constitution was obeyed. And we could get into a discussion about this a little bit later if you'd like to, about why they saw the presidency that way. They had real trouble in their state governments with the state legislatures changing constitutions all the time and doing all kinds of things. But the founders really preserved this idea that the president was supposed to be politically neutral. So our first presidents were not only chosen by this group of electors, which we had no say in, but our first presidents really saw this as their main task, as their job. And they didn't change that notion until the 1820s and the 1830s, thanks to this guy right here, Martin Van Buren. Did you ever have to memorize the presidents by any chance? Did anybody ever have to do that in school? I tried to do it when I was pretty young. I had trouble with it. You're okay with the first ones, right? George Washington, John Adams, Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, James Monroe. We know those names, and we know them because they're the Revolutionary War figures, right? They're the people who were most prominent in the Revolution. But then you get into people like James Polk, or Franklin Pierce, or Grover Cleveland. Anybody know all the major things Grover Cleveland did as president? Of course not. There's a good reason we don't know most of those presidents in the 1800s. They're a blur. The reason for that is very simple. When we, the people, started to have a say in who our president was going to be, when we started to vote for the president, the big fear at the time was that someone would use that power to get into the White House. That people would be, who want to be candidates for the presidency would start to use public opinion and public support to gain elector votes and become president. Now, the best way to do that back then was to use some issue that would excite the public, right? Some issue that would motivate people to support you. And of course, the big issue in the 1820s and 30s and 40s and 50s was slavery. So the fear was, on the part of Martin Van Buren and others, is that presidential candidates might try to use the slavery issue to ride into office on public opinion. If most people were anti-slavery, a candidate who wanted to be president would advocate for an anti-slavery platform. If most of the public was pro-slavery, a pro-slavery platform. But the danger was that every time someone would try to do that, play to public opinion in order to gain office, we call that demagogues, by the way, when people do that, appeals to the public to try to gain power. The fear was every time we had a presidential election, we could have a civil war afterwards, because either a pro-slavery or anti-slavery candidate would win and the country would be divided and we'd be plunged into civil war. So people like Martin Van Buren tried to engineer the process of choosing a president to make sure we didn't end up with people who would do that sort of thing. We need, Martin Van Buren said, some intermediary group to pick our candidates for us and to stay away from choosing demagogues who might try to use these issues. So what did they come up with? They came up with political parties. Political parties want to win everywhere in elections, right? They don't want to write off one half of the country or the other. They want to win everywhere. So the hope was that if the political parties did the choosing of presidential candidates, they would pick candidates who would not have strong views on these issues. They wanted to pick candidates who did not have a strong record on the slavery question, for example. They wanted to pick candidates that would follow the lead and the instruction of the political party as to how they were supposed to act and vote or exercise the power of office as president. So pick people that did not have divisive views over issues, and you'll have a safe election. And so parties gathered together to try to come up with whoever they thought their party presidential candidate should be who fit this bill. It's where we started to have political conventions. The party leaders would gather, they'd meet together in a political convention, and they would do the choosing of some candidate who would be a safe candidate to run everywhere in the country for the presidency. So we got a lot of presidential candidates during the 1800s that did not have strong views on issues, and when they got into office, simply did what the party leaders told them to do. And so we have this long string of presidents that we can't remember anything about. They did not take strong action as presidents. They weren't supposed to. They were chosen specifically so they wouldn't do that sort of thing. By the way, many of these party leaders would get together in a back room, the big party leaders of the big cities, and sit there and light up cigars to talk about how they were going to do this. We get the phrase smoke-filled room from that, and that was all decided in a smoke-filled room somewhere in politics. That phrase came out of this period of time. In fact, many of these candidates were referred to as dark horse candidates, much in a race where a horse comes out of nowhere to win the race that no one expected. These people were picking people to be their presidential candidates that no one expected to be their candidates. So in the end, we have that long string of presidents who are really do-nothing presidents. And as I say, you look at their pictures and you're not even sure who they are, right? Can't even remember their names. And there's very little about their presidencies to remember. Now, foreign policy was a little different. You know, when we had political conflicts between countries, sometimes presidents did have to step in as commander-in-chief. But most of these people who were president were not well known because they simply didn't do much. The only presidents who stand out of this group in the 1800s was Andrew Jackson, who refused to follow what the party told him to do, and Abraham Lincoln. But we only know about Lincoln because of the Civil War. Had the Civil War not happened, Lincoln may very well have been another one of these faces that we wouldn't know anything about. Because, again, the party picked Lincoln because Lincoln didn't have a strong set of views on slavery. And for many historians and many people looking back on Lincoln, they're a little critical of Lincoln for that reason, right? Why wasn't he stronger? Why wasn't he an abolitionist on slavery and so on? Well, Lincoln was picked because he was a safe candidate on those issues. This was such a sort of different understanding of the presidency, so different that when a visitor from England came to write a book about American politics, his name was Lord Bryce, and he wrote a very interesting book about how American government works because he was trying to explain it to people in England back home. And this is what he wrote about the president, describing the job of the president. It appears in a chapter in his book called Why Great Men Are Not Chosen President. That tells you everything about these presidents, right, at 1800s. Here's how he described the American presidency in that chapter. 4/5 of the work is the same kind as that which devolves on the chairman of a commercial company or the manager of a railway. That was his way of describing American presidents in the 1800s. Presidents are nothing more than a railway station runner to make sure the trains are on time. Hardly the kind of presidency we think of today, right? So all this changed. And it changed mainly at the turn of the last century. And it changed largely into what we today think of as our understanding of the presidency, thanks to this guy right here, Theodore Roosevelt. Teddy Roosevelt was the first president to come into office with an entirely different view of how the presidency was supposed to work. Now, I want you to understand, Article 2 of the Constitution, the article that describes the presidency, did not change during this time. The only real change in Article 2 was how we choose the president, the change in how the Electoral College works. That's the only amendment that has been made to Article 2. The very same amendment that the founders wrote is the very same amendment that Martin Van Buren understood the presidency to be, the very same amendment that drove or guided Teddy Roosevelt. No new powers were added. No new amendments were made to give the president more power. The only thing that changed was the view of how the presidency is supposed to work. And Teddy Roosevelt's view is the view that many presidents, especially from Franklin Roosevelt on, all presidents adopted as the view of how the presidency is supposed to operate. The president, POTUS stands for President of the United States, by the way, a little Washington speak for you. The president represents the nation and is connected to the people through their election. That was a fundamental notion of how the president was to speak for the country. And because the president offers himself as leader to the country, the president has to announce a political agenda that the president plans to follow. So no more do-nothing presidents of the 1800s. No more presidents standing apart from politics the way the founders described. Now the president's going to be specifically political, advancing a political agenda, representing the will of the people. When you elect me, you're telling me to go and do these things I promised you I would do. So that agenda is based on the popular will. The president is going to carry out what the public has instructed the president to do. And to do that, the president has to communicate that agenda to the people, talk to the people, sell their ideas to the people. And again, it sounds a little strange to say this, but before Teddy Roosevelt, presidents did not speak to the public very often. The only time presidents really addressed the public were informal sort of moments where presidents were invited to give dedications, usually, to a particular event. So presidents did not give speeches to the public when they campaigned. The party did all that. Presidents did not give State of the Union addresses. Ever since George Washington, the State of the Union address was actually a report that was delivered to Congress and read into the record by a clerk, simply because the president's required in the Constitution every year to give a report to Congress about the State of the Union. But no speech was given, none of that big room with everybody gathered, right, listening to the president. That was not done. The only speech really I think most of us can probably remember from the 1800s is the Gettysburg Address. And the Gettysburg Address was nothing more than a dedication of that cemetery. The main speaker that day was a guy named Edward Everett, who gave a 3-hour speech or 2-hour speech on the Battle of Gettysburg, what it meant historically. He used all kinds of allusions to the Peloponnesian War and other things to describe what had happened. He was the main speaker. All Lincoln was supposed to do was get up and give a short dedication of the cemetery. Of course, the words that he used were life-changing words, right? We still remember them today. But the point is, presidents did not give speeches. Teddy Roosevelt was the first to do that, to go out and actually give speeches to the public, advocate his agenda, really be the center of politics and the center of interest in politics. I'll tell you one quick story. Teddy Roosevelt was so interesting to people that whenever he went on a trip somewhere, all the press had to go with him because now people wanted to know what the president was doing. They wanted to have some idea what the president was up to. And Teddy loved to go hunting in Yellowstone National Park. So he packed up people at the White House and went out and set up tents in Yellowstone National Park and went hunting. And try to imagine all these reporters who had never left Washington or New York City are suddenly out in tents in the middle of nowhere in Yellowstone. Well, as the story goes, Teddy Roosevelt shot a bear that was attacking their camp one morning. And when the bear was shot, a small cub crawled out from underneath a bush. And Teddy felt bad. He realized the bear was a mother bear trying to protect its cub, and he felt terrible that they had killed the bear. This is how the story goes. So rather than leave the cub there, because the cub never would have been able to survive on its own, Teddy ordered that the cub be taken to Washington and be put into the Washington National Zoo so it could live out its life. Well, after that, every time political cartoonists drew Teddy Roosevelt in a political cartoon, they had a little bear drawn with him. The little bear followed Teddy all over the place. And a very enterprising toy maker came up with the idea of taking that bear and turning it into a small stuffed animal, which today we call, say it with me, teddy bears. Yeah, if you've ever wondered why we call them teddy bears, it's Teddy Roosevelt's bear. Teddy's bear has just been shortened to teddy bear over time. But that kind of centrality to American life, that celebrityhood that comes with being president, also comes with this new role the presidents play. So as I say, ever since Franklin Roosevelt, 20 or 30 years later, ever since Franklin Roosevelt, every American president has followed the rules of the modern presidency. Liberal or conservative doesn't matter. They've all played this role in one form or the other. So how is the unitary president different than this, right? Well, there's a couple ways in which this power changed dramatically after World War II. Gary Wills, who's a very interesting historian, wrote a book called Bomb Power not too long ago where he described this. He said, one of the things that changed in the American presidency was the development of the atomic bomb. And once the bomb was developed, the role of the president had to change. The first president to really deal with this was Harry Truman. When the bomb was developed, and in particular when Russia developed the bomb, and then much later China, we were now in a state of constant threat from the possibility of nuclear war. We've lived through this, right? The Cold War period where they had weapons aimed at us, we had weapons aimed at them. I have a hard time explaining this time to my 18-year-old students. Their world is completely different now. But there was a time where all of us were constantly under the threat of missiles being launched at the United States and we having to launch missiles at Russia in response. Well, when missiles were launched from Russia, presidents would have about 20 minutes to make the decision to launch our missiles in retaliation. So the idea that the president would go to Congress and ask for a declaration of war went right out the window. Now the president has to make the decision and be constantly ready to make the decision about whether or not to go to war. And that meant the president was continually in the state of being the commander-in-chief. We were constantly on a war footing. Even though we weren't shooting missiles at Russia or they shooting at us, every second that could happen, the president had to be ready for it. So the president continually served as commander-in-chief. Now, that gives the president a certain command of authority. And with that came something else, secrecy. Right after World War II, modeled, by the way, on the Manhattan Project that developed the bomb, the government began to establish agencies of the government that were designed to gather intelligence about the Russians, about the Soviet Union, and so on, in order to protect American interest. So in 1947, Harry Truman signs a law that creates the National Security Agency, the Central Intelligence Agency, and the National Security Advisor position, which Henry Kissinger operated for a while, just passed away just yesterday. So those positions became positions that were designed to not only gather secrets about the Russians, but also keep our secrets from the Russians. So suddenly, in a democracy where things are supposed to be open and the people should be able to judge them, we had this whole layer of secrecy around the presidency now. And some of you may remember in the 60s and 70s especially, we had a lot of revelations about things the CIA had been doing around the world, some disturbing stuff that came out with Edward Snowden about what the National Security Agency was doing and so on. This idea of secrecy became a part of American politics that had never existed before. And finally, and maybe most importantly, we had an ongoing sense of emergency in the country. The fact was that we were constantly under threat. And when the country is under threat, presidents can make a claim of power that does not appear in the Constitution. It's referred to as the prerogative power. John Locke, when he wrote his book, The Second Treatise of Government, back in the 1600s, wrote about this necessity. He said, whenever the survival of the country is at stake, it may become necessary for the executive power, he meant the king in his day, the executive power to do things that might in fact go against the law or even above the law in the name of saving the country. Things may be so extreme because the national survival is at stake, the executive has to do things that otherwise would never be legal, simply in the name of saving the country. Now, that notion carried over into the American presidency. Arthur Schlesinger writes a lot about this in his book, The Imperial Presidency. He says, they never talked about it at the Constitutional Convention, but they were all good Lockeans. They all read their John Locke. And he believes, and apparently other presidents believed, that presidents did have this power in the case of a national emergency. Now, if the president claims this power and we have no national emergency, Schlesinger said, we have a couple options. The Congress can impeach and remove a president who's broken the law, claiming that there's this big emergency that doesn't exist. So Congress can always impeach and remove a president if necessary if they claim this power unfairly. Or we, the people, can vote them out of office next election if we think they've exercised this power wrong. So there is a check on this power that comes with Congress and with the people. But the bottom line is, if we think the president's right, The country was under such threat that our survival was at stake, and thank goodness the president did whatever was necessary to make sure the country survived. In that case, we would applaud the president's use of prerogative power. So this power was always sort of there without really being stated. But there were times when you could hear presidents use that language. And I use as an example Abraham Lincoln, because Lincoln was president at a time when the country's survival was at stake, when the Constitution itself was at stake. And Lincoln wrote to a member of Congress explaining some of what he had done that actually was clearly in violation of the Constitution. For example, Lincoln had locked up people in the North who were producing newspapers that were sympathetic to the South. They called them Copperheads. Lincoln locked them up and threw them into jail and did not put them on trial. He didn't even want the possibility they'd get out. Now, the Constitution requires that when you're arrested, you have a right to be heard in front of a judge, to be arraigned. We call it habeas corpus, the right to be produced before a judge in order to hear the charges against you. But Lincoln completely ignored that part of the Constitution. The Supreme Court made a decision in the middle of his administration that one of the ships that had been seized by the North from England that was bringing supplies to the South were seized and illegally, and the Supreme Court said, you've got to turn that ship back over to the English. You have no right to seize that ship. They're not a combatant in all this. And Lincoln said, I don't care what the Supreme Court says. I'm not giving the ship back to the English. No way. So there were times when Lincoln clearly violated the rules of the Constitution. He made no bones about it. He was very upfront about admitting it. But here's how he explained it to a senator who asked him, how can you do these things under the Constitution? He said, I felt that measures otherwise unconstitutional might become lawful by being indispensable to the preservation of the Constitution through the preservation of the nation. There are times, Lincoln said, where I have done unconstitutional things, but I've done it in the name of preserving the nation and the Constitution. And in fact, a little earlier in that letter, he said, my oath of office, in fact, demanded it. I affirm that I will preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States. Lincoln said, it's exactly what I did when I did those unconstitutional things. I did unconstitutional things in the name of preserving, protecting, and defending the Constitution. So Lincoln certainly thought he had this power and had to use it in that circumstance. Ever since the development of the atomic bomb and this threat from Russia and this continual threat of emergency breaking out at any moment, other presidents began to make similar claims about the need for presidential power to do things that otherwise would go beyond the law. And Harry Truman made that kind of argument about, for example, a steel strike that took place during the Korean War. Truman said, if the steel strike doesn't get settled, I'm going to send in the army and they're going to take over the steel mills and they're going to run them. And the Supreme Court actually said, no, you can't do that in a decision called Youngstown Sheehan 2 versus Sawyer. But Truman and others ever since have continually claimed the power to do more and more as president in the name of keeping the country safe from this threat from the Soviet Union. That ongoing danger became an excuse for expanding presidential power. Now we get to the more modern age. All the way through the 60s, 70s, 80s, even the 90s, this kind of claim of the direct threat of the Soviet Union was always a reason why presidents said we have to keep things secret, we have to do things that otherwise would be illegal, and so on. But after 9/11, all of this got ramped up into what now we call the Unitary Presidency. Let me explain what I mean by that. George W. Bush, as president, had, as a vice president, a man named Dick Cheney, right, we're all familiar with. Cheney believed very strongly that all the way through the 60s and 70s and even the 80s, the presidency, he thought, had been weakened by things like Vietnam and Watergate. And he was convinced that a president needs to begin to assert presidential power in a new kind of way. He referred to it as the Unitary Presidency. The president would be the most important part of government. And in fact, all the other parts of government would yield to what the president wanted to do. That was this notion of the Unitary Presidency. He advanced it with George Bush, didn't catch on for Bush right away. Bush was a little suspicious of the whole idea. And then 9/11 happened. And suddenly we're back to the idea of a continual threat against the United States. And now President Bush was saying, I need to do all kinds of extraordinary things in order to make sure that we're safe from the next terrorist attack. And he began to assert a series of presidential powers. Those powers were picked up largely because much of the groundwork for this was laid during two previous administrations, President Reagan and his own father, George Herbert Walker Bush. Both Reagan and Bush had begun to use presidential power in a new way that George W. Bush simply took to a new extreme. Let me explain two areas of power where this happened. The first one we have to talk about in terms of Article 2 of the Constitution. In Article 2 of the Constitution says the executive power shall be vested in the President of the United States. And it says a little further in Article 2, the President shall take care that the laws are faithfully executed. Now, the way this argument works about the unitary presidency is that those two grants of power in Article 2 give the president a tremendous amount of power that is not defined further in the Constitution. If Congress has the power to do something, fine. If the court has power to do something, fine. But anything else that Congress or the Supreme Court can't do falls to the president as part of executive power. So that phrase, executive power, is a widespread grant of power, this argument makes. And we don't know what's all included in that grant of power. We simply know that the president has been given a tremendous amount of power that presidents can then claim. So it's like a blank check almost. I always explain it to my students. Here's what I do when I do it. I bring a bag of candy to class, actually, a big bag of Halloween candy. And I tell them the interpretation these folks give to the idea of executive power is that there are certain things Congress can do, like declaring war, for example. So I take a piece of candy out and I put that aside. And they could do other things like confirming ambassadors or ratifying treaties, and I take another piece of candy out. And then I say, but that's it. Once you go through the list of what Congress can do, everything else that's left in that bag is left for the president to use. And we don't know how much candy is left in that bag. It doesn't matter. Whatever's left in that bag belongs to the president, and the president will tell us what's left in that bag by saying, I can do this, I can do that, and so on. So the whole idea of executive power is it's this wide sweeping grant of power that we don't know what's all included. And when the president takes care that the law is faithfully executed, there are tools by which the president can do that that can also expand presidential power. So, as I say, a couple examples. One is something called signing statements. When a president signs a bill into law, Congress passes a resolution, they pass a bill, the president sits down and signs the bill into law. When the president signs a bill into law, presidents have traditionally issued something called a signing statement. Sometimes they've even read it at the ceremony. Usually it's a formality, the president saying, well, you know, we're proud that we got this done, et cetera, et cetera. Here's all the good things this law will do. Beginning with Reagan, and especially with George Herbert Walker Bush, presidents began to use signing statements for a different reason. They began to say in these signing statements that the law they just passed that's going to be carried out by them, take care that the laws are faithfully executed, right? In the signing statement, I'm going to explain to you how I'm going to carry out that law. And there are times when presidents have said, the law says I have to do A, but I'm not going to do A right away. Or the law says I have to do A and B, and I'm only going to do B. That is what a signing statement often says. It selects out parts of the bill that the president just signed into law, but the president says in the signing statement, however, there are parts of this law I'm not going to enforce, I'm not going to do, even though he just signed it into law. When Ronald Reagan did that sort of thing, he changed through 250 different moments in signing statements over the years of his 8 years as president. He changed 250 different parts of bills with signing statements, took the meaning of the bill and turned it into something else simply by saying, I signed this bill into law, but I'm going to administer it this way. Roughly 34% of the bills that Reagan signed had 34% in total had significant changes because of these 250 alterations of the bill. George Herbert Walker Bush signed 228 of these signing statements during his 4 years as president. So he signed many more in his 4 years than in comparison to the 8 years of Ronald Reagan. Roughly half of the bills that he signed and made these signing statements, roughly half of what was in those bills was changed because of these signing statements, one way or the other. George W. Bush, oh, sorry, I forgot I had Clinton in there. Clinton had 381 signing statement changes during his administration, but they were not all that significant. They didn't change that much in the bills that he issued signing statements on. Now, I'll get to George W. Bush. 12,000 different changes to bills through signing statements, changing a much higher significant percentage of what those bills were all about. That is essentially rewriting the legislation through signing statements. I'll give you a great example of this, just to make it clear how this works. When the evidence was produced about torture that was taking place with Iraqi detainees, you might remember Abu Ghraib, the pictures from the prison that came out. Congress decided to try to pass a law that would limit the president's ability to use torture as a technique for interrogation. That effort was led by John McCain. McCain had spent years in the North Vietnamese prison during the Vietnam War. He certainly knew what torture was all about. And he said, I don't believe our country should be doing these things. So I'm writing a bill that essentially says the president shall not use torture techniques on prisoners anymore. George Bush knew when that bill passed Congress that it passed by a large margin. So much so that if he vetoed that bill, he knew Congress could easily override his veto. He had no choice but to sign that bill into law. He was very unhappy about it. He thought it limited his power as president too much, gave speeches against it, but Congress passed it by wide margins. He had no choice. He had to sign it into law. So he did. And when he signed it, he issued a signing statement. And in that signing statement, he said, okay, the law says the president's not allowed to use torture techniques anymore, but as president, I get to decide what's a torture technique and what isn't. And of course, the administration went on doing what it did before. So in the end, signing statements can completely undermine the meaning of legislation. Presidents can literally rewrite what Congress has done. Now, we've had fewer of these signing statements in recent presidencies for one simple reason. Presidents haven't had much of an opportunity because Congress hasn't produced a lot of legislation lately. There haven't been a lot of major bills passed by Congress where presidents have the opportunity to use signing statements. So this has sort of dropped off as the level of production in Congress of legislation has dropped off. This current Congress has passed less legislation. You have to go all the way back to Herbert Hoover's administration to find a Congress that has passed less legislation than this one has. So it's been a very unproductive time for Congress, and there's very few opportunities to do this. But presidents have a second tool that they use, something called executive orders. This one's an even bigger power that presidents have been using. When presidents issue executive orders, they are instructing their administration on how to carry out the laws of the land. Again, the president takes care that the laws are faithfully executed. The executive order tells people in the administration how to execute those laws. That's the idea of an executive order. Presidents have used them for years. They've been around since the very early presidents. Some presidents have used them to create national holidays. Some presidents have used them to create national parks, like Teddy Roosevelt. Franklin Roosevelt infamously used an executive order to set up the camps that Japanese Americans were imprisoned in during World War II, probably one of the worst uses of executive orders back then. But most presidents have used them for very ceremonial kinds of things. What's been happening recently, more and more often, is that presidents have been using executive orders to do things that they can't get done by Congress. George W. Bush issued in his presidency, for the 8 years of his presidency, 291 executive orders. And many of those executive orders ordered things to be done by his administration that Congress did not pass as legislation. He simply said, I want you to go and do this, whether Congress has approved it or not. Barack Obama, when he was president, issued 276 executive orders during his 8 years as president. Obama decried the use of executive orders when he was a candidate in 2008. Then he turned around and used them anyway. He got frustrated with Congress. Congress wasn't doing anything, wasn't passing legislation, he went ahead and started issuing executive orders. I'll give you a good example, again, something you've heard of. When Congress wouldn't pass immigration reform legislation, Barack Obama issued an executive order to create something called DACA, the Deferred Action on Childhood Arrivals. It essentially said to his administration and the people who were enforcing immigration law, I don't want you to use your power to deport children who were born in the United States, even if their parents are here without documentation. It was his way of essentially protecting those kids from their parents' decision. Wasn't passed by Congress, wasn't a law. He just simply said to his people, don't enforce the law on those folks with an executive order. Donald Trump as president, in his 4 years as president, keep in mind, these two presidents are in office for 8 years, issued 220 executive orders during his 4 years as president. He is the leader in the executive order race in all this. More executive orders than any president has issued in recent history. And Joe Biden has issued 126 already during his first term as president. Now, here's the interesting thing. Executive orders aren't law. They're not law. When an executive order is issued, the next president can simply issue a new executive order taking back the previous president's executive order. So executive orders can be undone by the next president. In addition to that, executive orders can be challenged in court. If an executive order does something that's unconstitutional, the Supreme Court can weigh in and declare it unconstitutional. So you can challenge an executive order in that way. Congress can even pass a law undoing an executive order if they want to. That's a lot harder to do these days with the division in Congress, but they can do it. Most of the executive orders that have been issued by presidents have ended because the next president undid them. So the reason Joe Biden's numbers are so high, I think, you could summarize, is the fact that many of his early executive orders were undoing the 220 executive orders that President Trump issued. And no doubt, if the next president is a Republican, they'll undo a lot of Joe Biden's executive orders. That's the way this tends to work. But the point is, this is government without Congress. This is essentially governing and creating policy without having to get Congress to approve it. And again, a lot of reason presidents are doing this is because they're just desperate. Congress isn't doing much. They feel they have to do this sort of thing in order to get things done. But the bottom line is there's no check on this power, right? Congress doesn't have to deliberate on these things. Presidents are simply ordering that these things are being done. So the unitary executive is taking these tools, signing statements, executive orders, and using them to a much greater degree than previous presidents have ever used them. And they're using it in a different way as well. They're using it to undo legislation that Congress has passed, or they're doing it simply to replace legislation that Congress is unwilling to pass. Either way, they're doing things that go beyond the understanding that I grew up with and you grew up with about checks and balances and separation of power. You essentially have Congress doing nothing and the president acting as Congress through executive orders in this way. And that's created a real danger for the future. Because the question is, how far does this go? How much do presidents try to do through executive orders? The only presidential candidate that has talked about doing things through executive orders is this guy right here. Donald Trump is the only presidential candidate so far who's openly talked about using these powers if he gets back into office. And some of the things that he's talked about are things like canceling spending on programs or particularly government agencies that Congress has funded. By the way, that technically is unconstitutional. I think he probably would be challenged if he tried to do that, and he'd probably lose. It's called impoundment is the phrase that's used, and the Supreme Court declared that unconstitutional back in 1974. He's talked about firing agency heads that are not in line with what he wants policies to be in independent agencies. That he could do as president as part of his executive order power. He's also talked about reassigning agency personnel. If you're in an agency and you're not doing what the president wants, he's going to move you to a different agency where you won't be able to block him anymore. That also he can do through executive order. Again, ordering his administration to operate in a certain way. And you've probably heard about this business about changing deportation policy, right? deporting people or setting up camps where people will be gathered to be deported and so on. All of that can be done through executive order. I mean, Franklin Roosevelt essentially did that sort of thing with Japanese Americans during World War II. It's no different by doing it through executive order in the way that Donald Trump is describing. So far, at least in 2024, Donald Trump is the only one that's been pretty upfront about the idea that he's going to use these powers to the maximum if he becomes president again. Will the other presidential candidates do it if they get into office? Well, history tells us they will. Even presidents who, again, railed against the use of signing statements, executive orders, like Barack Obama, ended up using them in the end, simply out of frustration. But this idea that presidents can now take this power and essentially run the government on their own without having to worry about what Congress thinks, without having to worry about what Congress passes as laws, that's the unitary presidency. That's the executive power taken to a new level. And that's the presidency that we have today. It's not altogether clear how we'll ever get out of that kind of presidency. It certainly seems to be here to stay. And it's only a question of how presidents are going to use those powers in ways that either we may approve of or disapprove of. But it's hard to imagine any president giving up those powers now that they've been asserted in this way. So it's going to take an active Congress and an active Supreme Court to try to rein in some of this. And so far, Congress has been unable or unwilling to do that. And the Supreme Court may or may not step in on some of these issues. We're going to have to wait and see if, in fact, this does become the policy of the United States, whether or not the Supreme Court will support it. As I say, certainly I think the first one they will be against, at least if they stick to the precedent. The others, a little more questionable whether or not they would consider any of that unconstitutional under the executive power of the president. I've gone on long enough. I'm curious to hear your thoughts, your questions, anything that comes to mind as we talk about all this.
Thank you so much, Dr.
Sure.
Smailes. I wanted to quickly ask, when folks ask a question or have a comment, would you summarize it
Sure.
into your mic
I'll
for
be
the
glad
folks
to.
who are at home?
Yeah, no problem.
And while I have the mic, I want to ask a question myself.
Sure.
So infamously, the Second Amendment has that comma that changes how it's read. I noticed
Yeah.
there's not an Oxford comma in the oath of office.
No.
Does that change how people interpret it?
In what part?
The
Are you-
final two lines.
Why don't we
There's
go
not an
back to
Oxford
it so
comma
people
between
can look
them.
at it? Sure.
I didn't know if that was equally controversial or if it was grammatically unimportant.
Let me go back to the oath so we can look at it. It's a little dizzying, isn't it, when I do this? Sorry about that. Get there in a second. There we go. So you're talking about a comment between
After
protect and
protect.
defend? Yeah, I don't think it really means a whole lot in the meaning of the phrase, right? But I do think, again, that when we think of preserve, protect, and defend, we have to remember what that meant to the founders, first of all, right? Their notion, again, was the president would use the veto power to do that. And certainly when we talk about preserving, protecting, and defending the Constitution, as Lincoln did, he interpreted that as a reason to claim this prerogative power. In order to save the Constitution, I have to do unconstitutional things, was his argument. So in that sense, that phrase is actually meant to be, I think, an entire phrase rather than being broken up with an additional comma. I think it's really meant to be all three things together, right, as a single task, you might say. So I think that's what it means. I mean, who knows what the founders really had in mind when they wrote it, but clearly their intention, what we know from the other ways that they wrote about the presidency, was that they were talking about the veto power more than anything else. Yeah. Yes, I saw another hand. Go right ahead. Yeah.
Going back to your discussion of Martin Van Buren.
Yes.
My understanding is that political parties actually were born between John Adams and Thomas Jefferson.
That's correct.
Clarify what you meant.
Sure. The question is, the political parties really started at the beginning of, or right around the period of John Adams and Thomas Jefferson's elections. So can I clarify a bit of what I meant by the political parties? You're absolutely right. The beginning of the political party system was around that time, the election of 1800. That was when really the first political party was organized by Thomas Jefferson. They called themselves, confusingly enough, the Democrat Republicans, right? And then John Adams's party was the Federalist Party, and that election was a very bitter election between the two of them. Parties existed after that, you're absolutely right. But this new role the party would play as the selector of candidates, that's what changed during Martin Van Buren's administration. You know, it's funny, when the first elections took place and the electors voted, they were given a blank piece of paper at the state capitol, and they were told, write down 2 names of people you think should be president. That was all they were told. There were no political parties in the first election. So they had to put down 2 people that they just thought would make a good president. And the hope was there would be enough people with enough national reputation, as they said, to rise to the top of the minds of these electors. And of course, there were George Washington, John Adams, Thomas Jefferson. Again, they were names that came into people's heads when they thought about this. I always like to say to my students, which 2 names would you write down if you had that opportunity today? Because they didn't have to be politicians, and there were no political parties choosing candidates back then. You just wrote down 2 people who thought should be president. So one of my students said, Taylor Swift. I didn't sleep for 3 days after that one. I was like, oh my God, you're kidding. But anyway, that's the way the original elections worked. Then, for a number of years, it was actually Congress that picked who their presidential candidates would be. They called it King Caucus back then. All the members of a political party would gather who were in Congress, and they would advance some name that they thought should be the presidential candidate. And then eventually parties took over that function. And again, with Martin Van Buren's notion, the convention became the place where parties named who the candidate was going to be. And by the way, that continued all the way up until 1968. All the way through our history of presidential elections, the candidates for president were chosen at conventions that were dominated by and controlled by the party leaders. It wasn't until after the 68 election, you remember the chaos in Chicago for the Democrats in 1968. When that happened, the Democrats said, we need a new way to pick our delegates to the convention. We've got to give more power to the what they called the rank and file members of the party. So they changed the rules so that presidential primaries would elect people to be delegates to the convention to go and vote for the candidates, which is what we do today. So we, the people, actually had very little, if no say, in who presidential candidates were going to be until that change in 1972. They had a few primaries around, but none of them elected enough delegates for anybody to ever win the nomination of the party. And candidates used primaries to demonstrate how popular they were in the party, but they didn't actually get chosen through presidential primaries. Again, I'll give you a good example that probably will pop into your head. When John Kennedy ran for president in 1960, he had the problem, of course, of being a Roman Catholic candidate. And a lot of people in the Democratic Party said a Catholic will never get elected president of the United States. So Kennedy decided to enter the West Virginia primary. And West Virginia was something like 98% Protestant. So Kennedy said, if I can win the West Virginia primary and I can prove that Protestant Democrats will vote for me, that will prove that my religion is not a barrier to me being president. And sure enough, he poured a lot of money and a lot of effort into winning West Virginia, and he won the West Virginia primary. Now, that didn't help him get the nomination by electing delegates to go to the convention. That didn't do him much good at all when it came to that. But it convinced the party leaders that Kennedy was a viable candidate, even though he was Catholic, and so he ended up getting the nod in 1960. So yeah, the system we have today with primaries, they're coming up soon, right? I think we're less than 40 some days away from the Iowa caucus and the New Hampshire primary coming. That whole system where we vote, delegates are assigned to the convention and to candidates and so on, that's a relatively modern way of choosing our candidates for the presidency. Before that, we didn't do it. The party leaders did it. And even today, we still have those super delegates that go to the convention who are people in the party who get named to essentially go and vote as delegates in the convention. That was a big point of controversy in 2016 when those super delegates pledged themselves to Hillary Clinton instead of Bernie Sanders. And Sanders said, hey, that's unfair. You got 700 or 800 people voting for who the nominee is going to be, and they weren't voted on by any of the Democratic people in the primaries. But that was the party rule. It was still held over that we still allowed party leaders to be a part of that process. That was a long answer to your question, but it was a great question. I hope you don't mind me getting into it. Yeah, go ahead. I see a couple hands. Yeah. Yeah. That's a good question. Right. Yeah, I said that presidents did not talk to the public, and the question is, what about Lincoln's second inaugural address? The inaugural addresses was the single time that presidents gave speeches like that. And I thank you for reminding me of that. I should have mentioned it. That was the only time that presidents actually delivered speeches. And of course, that speech was printed around the country, but very few people actually heard it because, of course, we didn't have mass media back then. So the reality is, reading it was a little different than hearing it, right? When people give speeches. But you're right. The inaugural addresses were really the only time presidents actually got up in front of a crowd and gave a speech like that, other than dedication remarks. And really, most of the people who paid attention to inaugural addresses were generally not the public at large. I'll give you another very interesting fact about the presidency back in the 1800s. Most presidents weren't recognized by people when they were seen in the 1800s. Presidents could literally walk down Pennsylvania Avenue and no one knew who they were. Try to imagine that today, right? It's completely different. But back then, the presidency was so removed from the public, most people didn't pay much attention to the president or the presidency. And if you think of your American history, you'll remember when it came to the slavery question, the big fights were in Congress, right? Henry Clay, Daniel Webster, John C. Calhoun. Those were the people who came up with the Missouri Compromise and the Kansas-Nebraska Act and so on. Congress was the place where big decisions were being made in government, and presidents had nothing really to do with those decisions. So we did have a period of time where the presidency was, I hate to say do nothing, because, of course, when there were wars, presidents had to step in as commander in chief, but they were not leaders in any real sense of the country. Leadership came from the House and the Senate, particularly the Senate. And politicians who were leaders of the Senate and the House were much more important than presidents. I'll give you one quick example of that if I can. There was a guy who was the Speaker of the House of Representatives. His name was Joe Cannon. And Joe Cannon was so autocratic in his running of the House of Representatives. People quaked in his presence. People were afraid of him. So terrified of his presence. He went down to the House cafeteria one day for lunch, and Joe Cannon's favorite food for lunch was Navy bean soup. I hate it myself. My father used to love Navy bean soup. I always found it kind of disgusting. But anyway, that was Joe Cannon's favorite lunch, Navy bean soup. He went down to the House of Representatives cafeteria. They didn't have Navy bean soup on the menu. And he said, from now on, every day, I want Navy bean soup on the menu. Oh my gosh, sorry, I just clicked my thing off here. It's all right. My Navy bean soup on the menu of the House of Representatives cafeteria. And to this day, if you go to the House of Representatives cafeteria, you will find Navy bean soup still on the menu. That's how afraid people were of this guy. To this day, people don't want to cross him. They called him Foul-Mouthed Joe, but he decided the policy of the country, not the president's. The only president he couldn't control in that way was Teddy Roosevelt. Roosevelt opposed him, and they had clashes like crazy. Both were Republicans. Both were, leaders of their party, but Teddy Roosevelt was not about to cede control of government to Foul-Mouthed Joe. So we have had times where Congress was much more important than the president. And I'll leave you with this thought as well. The founders thought of it that way as well. It's no accident Article 1 is about Congress. And it's much more detailed about how Congress is going to work. The founders thought Congress would be the most important branch of government. The president was there to keep them in line, but Congress was the place where government would take place. Congress was the place where important decisions would be made. It was Congress that was supposed to lead the country. And for much of our history, as I say, Congress was the place where the real political action was, the real decisions were being made until the modern presidency, and all that changed with Teddy Roosevelt and the teddy bears, right, that came with it. Any other questions that I can address? Yeah, you had your hand in the back. I'm sorry. Yeah. Yeah. Right. 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 Right, right. Yeah, that's a good question. Let me repeat it for the folks who are watching on Zoom. Tell me if I've got this right. The question comes down to, would an independent candidate essentially be able to undo a lot of what's happening with the growth of presidential power because they would not be tied to a party and the party wouldn't be tied to them in a sense, right? They'd be totally independent of all that. One thing to keep in mind is that parties have very little influence over candidates anymore. We used to talk about party platforms all the time. Remember those days? People would talk about party platforms. Parties write platforms at conventions anymore, and they absolutely mean nothing to the candidates who are running for the office. They give lip service to it, but they don't follow it in any way. Do you know what the Republican Party platform was in 2020? In essence, whatever Donald Trump says the party platform is, that's the party platform. That was it. Whatever the president was, it's like one page describing that. So it is true that parties in the past really were able to instruct candidates, and certainly in the 1800s, they played that role. Their party platforms had to be sworn to by the president, the presidential candidate they were going to name. Right after Abraham Lincoln was notified of his nomination, the very first thing he sent back in response was, "I pledge myself to the party platform in all matters," because he wanted to make it clear that he was going to follow the party's lead. Independent candidates could do that. I think you're right. And I think you're right that an independent candidate might be able to step out of some of this. But I think the thing to keep in mind is no matter who's in the Oval Office, as long as Congress is unable to do its job, and as long as there are issues that have to be resolved, presidents are always going to be tempted to use executive orders, I think. I don't think they're ever going to get away from that, even an independent candidate. Signing statements, a little bit different, but still, if Congress does produce legislation that a president doesn't like, even an independent president, they could still undo parts of that with signing statements. And I think, again, that's a power they'll be tempted to use, especially as an independent candidate if they don't feel an alliance with either political party who's making that law, right? They may not like the law. They may have to sign it, again, because it's popular, but they may still undo it with signing statements. So I don't know when independent is really going to make all this go away. They may use it differently, but I'm not sure they'll ever be able to really get away from using the powers that we're talking about here with the unitary presidency. It's really a question of degree. How far will someone go in using those powers? I got it off the screen now, but Donald Trump has pledged to use those powers in some pretty strong ways in what he's pledging to do. And whether you agree with it or not doesn't matter. The fact of the matter is that's using the executive order power to a much greater degree than he even tried to do when he was president during his 4 years. It's a use of executive orders to a greater degree than ever been used before. Will he pull it off? Again, it kind of depends on whether or not Congress will try to undo some of what he does through executive orders, or if the Supreme Court declares what he's doing unconstitutional. But if those two institutions don't check his power, he can use executive powers to do an awful lot of things that, again, normally you would think Congress would have to pass a law in order to do. But that's what executive orders do. That's their effect. I think I saw one more hand, and then I think we have to quit. We're almost out of time here. Yeah, 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 yeah.
Do you have any idea how Congress reacted to that?
That's a really good question. How did Congress react when Lincoln did unconstitutional things? Well, Congress itself was dominated by the Republican Party, by Lincoln's party. So they were willing to cooperate with a lot of what Lincoln did. But many of them were very privately critical of what Lincoln did. And many of them started to talk about him as King Abraham and, the emperor up at the White House and so on. They had all kinds of sort of derogatory ways of referring to him because they thought that he used his power too far in that way. So there was not a lot of approval necessarily from those people, but not a lot of public criticism either. Even Lincoln's own cabinet members called into question some of what he was doing and said, we think you're going too far in much of the way that you're using this power. But Lincoln essentially said, I have to do it. I think my oath requires that I do it. Preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution. I'll do whatever I have to do to make that happen. And we've been debating ever since whether or not, in fact, Lincoln was justified in doing that. And there's been a lot of back and forth with Lincoln biographers about whether or not they approved of whether they personally approve of what Lincoln did in making some of those decisions. But that's history, right? That's sort of the way it works. We always debate the wisdom of some of these things in hindsight. but certainly Lincoln thought it was necessary himself, and he thought he would be violating his oath if he didn't do those things. I'm sorry we're out of time, folks. It's been fun. I appreciate you coming tonight, and I've really enjoyed talking with you and discussing it. So thank you very much. Thank you. Thanks. I appreciate it.
Thank you so much to Dr. Smailes. Thank you all for joining us tonight, both in the room and at home. We hope that you'll join us starting on January 11th. Dr. Kelly Ann Kolodny will be talking about forest bathing, the impacts of going out into nature and experiencing nature. So we hope that you will join us for a discussion on that on January 11th at 7 p.m. And until then, have a great winter.